Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. So welcome to GTAP 7 database live session. So we have had two sessions before. One was on the GTAP 7 database in January 2009, and the other was a few months ago on GTAP Africa database. So today we'll have a live session on bilateral services trade data in GTAP 7 database. So we released the GTAP 7 database in November 2008, and one of the main improvements in the database was bilateral services trade data. And here we have with us Mr. Nico van Leeuwen and Mr. Robert McDougall, so both of whom have made significant improvements in bilateral services trade data in GTAP 7 database. So now I request Nico van Leeuwen and Robert McDougall to give an introduction on bilateral services trade data in GTAP 7 database, and after that you can ask questions that you have on this particular data set, and we'll be happy to address your questions.
Thank you, Badri. This is Nico, for those who don't recognize my voice. I am here on a 6 month, you could say, loan from CPB. This presentation is done in two parts. First part by me and deals with what CPB has done as a contribution for the bilateral services trade data for GTAP 7. And the second part will be done by my neighbor Rob, who has done a lot to implement our work in the total GTAP database. Welcome to you all. We have seen the list of people who subscribed. Unfortunately, not everybody is online yet, but there is a long list of people from all over the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are in room 661. It's weather is pretty nice outside. Still a bit chilly, but not as bad as some time ago. Let's go to the topic. As Badri said, it is a major improvement. I fully agree with that, but at the same time, we think there is still a lot to be done, and that is what we like to show you in the next few slides. Anybody who wants to ask questions during the slides is most welcome. We will answer them straight away. The structure of this forum is we would like to talk about the services trade data in GTAP, and more in particular about the bilateral services trade data from the OECD. That's our main source. Then I would like to go on to the CPB methodology and show some results. And finally, I would like to tell you what CPB can do for the next GTAP database, version number 8. And then after that, Rob will continue with what he has done basically to build it into the GTAP database, and what are the opportunities. And if there is time left, I understand that we have got 1.5 hours to present you the results. So if, for instance, after half an hour or 45 minutes there are no more questions, we can discuss alternative methods CPB has developed. I'll come back to that if we do that. Now, services trade data in GTAP consists actually of 4 parts. There are the non-margin services. That is basically this presentation. And to give you an idea of what we talk about, in 2004 it consists of 12% of the total world trade. And as far as I know, that percentage is increasing over time. Then there are the margin services usage and the margin services supply. Both are international freight transport from the usage side and from the supply side. And that counts for about 3.5% of the total trade. Finally, there is the traveler's expenditure. That is what you and I consume abroad, which is about 6% of the trade. Again, we will talk about the top bullet. The other things are to be documented in chapter 9D of the GTAP 7 documentation, which we hope will be published soon. The GTAP trade data on services in the past. So far, bilateral trade flows, although they are in the database, are not based on observations. There are 11 sectors for non-margin flows. There is export of margin in transport sectors. They cover all the GTAP countries and the regions, and the sources have been used were the IMF balance of payment statistics and the Center of Global Trade Analysis, which is this center, and they were done by Rob and Hagemeyer. And then they use a RAS procedure to rebalance the exports and the imports, and that was done on bilateral commodity trade flows. So all the bilateral data are kind of an estimation based on the row totals and the column totals and the shares of the commodities. Why would we like to improve the non-margin services? And now I'm talking from a CBB perspective. Since 1995 there are several agreements set up to liberalize the markets. First of all, there is the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the GATT, in 1995, and also out of the Doha rounds there was this urge to open the service markets. And for the EU, we are a Dutch organization with interest in developments in the EU. There are the Services Directive from 2004 to open up the intra-EU markets. And in order to do that, we would like to use the general equilibrium analysis, and therefore the GTAP database is a very valuable instrument. But up until version number 6 of the GTAP, the bilateral trade data, bilateral services data, were kind of constructed. And since we also work together with the OECD, we got hold of a nice database in 2004, which consists of data collected by the OECD, by Eurostat, for more sectors than was until then available. However, some of these data are officially unpublished, and we have got them, we've got permission to use these data. We have contributed them to the GTAP 7 database, and a paper, I come back to that later, is published in 2008. Is there any questions to answer? I see that Ango is giving some answers. If Rob thinks that I have to stop, just give me a signal, please. This new OECD database with data in 2004, it consists of bilateral flows from 29 reporters and many partner countries. You have to imagine that all these reporters export flows to not only the 29 countries, or let's say the 28 other countries, but also to all the other countries in the world. This covers more than 70% of the cross-border of world exports and imports of services in 2004. So for us, that is would be a major improvement. It is available for both exports and imports. What does it mean? That, come back to that later, that actually there are mirror data, which means that one country reports an export of, let's say, France to the UK, and UK reports the imports from France for that same product group. And unfortunately, as you may expect, the numbers are not identical. What is good in this database? There is a breakout of commercial services into 8 subsectors. And the OECD database has made use of the IMF, so that is actually the same source GTAP is using, with information from country experts and from Eurostat. Now, to give you an idea of the concordances between the OECD and the GTAP, you see here this table. Total services obviously is total services, transportation is transport, which will later on has to be disaggregated in the 3 transport sectors distinguished in the GTAP database. Then there is travel. Communication services is communication, construction services is construction, insurance services is insurance. Then there is financial services, is the sector OFI. Computer services and information services is part of the sector OBS, other business services in GTAP. Then there is a sector which is called royalties and license fees. They are not included in the GTAP database because they are part of factor income payments. And then there is other business services, also part of OBS sector, and then there is the ROS, the recreational and other services, and the government services. Then you see in italics this special sector, other commercial services, which is actually the sum of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sectors. So what you normally will see in databases, and what you can still find in the OECD database, is just bilateral trade between the total services, transport, travel, and this sector. So most interesting part for us was the disaggregation of these sectors. However, what I would like to show you is the availability of the data, and that may seem to be a little bit disappointing, but we have to work with it. On this graph you see for 5 years, 1999 up until 2004, the availability of data for the sector of transportation. The black bar says that there is a flow for both export and import. So that means that we have a mirror observation for that particular cell. Now for 1999, and for each country, the maximum number of observation is 900. 30 times 30 is 900. Of course, out of the 900, 29 are by definition missing, because that is the flow to itself. Which means that export and import in 1999 for the sector transportation is almost 200. If there is only an export flow available, if you look at this bar, it's more than 200. If there is only an import available from the report to import, then there is this bar. And the two missings are more than any other bar in 1999. Fortunately, what we see that the black bar is increasing over time up until 2002. Unfortunately, it's going down again between 2002 and 2004. Now please note that this research was basically done in the years 2006 and 2007. So I would have no idea what the present situation is. This presentation was presented before at the GTAP conference in 2007. But this is the situation as we have used for the GTAP 7 database. Again, this is for the sector transportation, of which you may recall that it was a pretty good covered sector. For one of the subsectors of the other commercial services, the financial services NEC, which is an important sector for us, the results are a lot more disappointing. Let's say there are only 50 observations of both export and import in 1999. That number again is increasing. But as you can see, there are many what we call double missings in the database of the OECD. What we have done, I'll come back to that in the next slide. The next slide, I want to discuss with you what we have done in order to get a full matrix of 29 by 29 countries. Again, we have gathered the data reported for exports and imports. And then we have determined the most reliable reporter for the two mirror flows. And in order to do that, we have used the Gellhardt method. The Gellhardt method is from Mark Geller, who works at the USDA, and who has done similar work for the commodity trade flows, of which obviously you also have mirror data. Many more mirror data, unfortunately, than for services. And he has developed a so-called reliability index by sector and reporting country. We have done the same for the same years 1992 up to 2004. And he thinks that the observations are reliable if the value of the reporting countries deviates less than 20%. Now, there is a lot of arguments about 20%. That is a bit, what is the base of that 20%? But Gellhardt considered 20% the benchmark for a observation which is going to be reliable. From that he has created the index, and of course it's obvious that the highest index between a reporting flow, either exporting or importing, determines the value. What the result of that is, I will show you later on in some graphs. It also means that if a country reports an NA or a missing for that year, the contribution is obviously zero. So again, that is for the mirror flows. If there is only one observation, either an exporting or an importing observation, then we simply use that observation, since there is no, we don't know what the other observation would be. You can also deliberate on that. If there is no observation at all for the flow, we have done some estimations. And doing so, we have been pretty pragmatic. We haven't used a complicated estimation system. We have, in most cases, made use of information of, for instance, the flow to EU15 or a flow to total OECD or something near to that, and then of course the share of that. And strange enough, which you will also find in FDI data and in other data, unfortunately in the database there are a few observations which are less than 0. We don't know really what to do with it, so we have decided that those observations are 0. To come back to these reliability indices in percentage average of all country, this graph shows you that the results for especially the new sectors are pretty disappointing. The maximum, of course, is 100%, but for these sectors it barely reached a few percent. But that is what we have to live with. It also shows that for the 4 sectors, well, I have to exclude total, of course, but for transport, travel, and other commercial services, the indices are at least a little bit higher. But it gives you another idea of the availability of data in that database. Now to show you the effects of the Gallagher method and also the difference between reporting export and reported import, I show you a graph of other commercial services in 2002 of the flows from France to Germany, Italy and United Kingdom. So the France reports to Germany this amount, to Italy this amount, and to the United Kingdom that amount. Germany reports a flow from France much higher than this amount. Again, Italy reports also a higher amount, but the United Kingdom reports a fractionally lower amount. What is the final result according to Gallagher? Apparently that in this particular case, Germany is a more reliable reporter than France. So Gallagher simply says we take this value and not that value. We also don't take something in between, no, we simply take this value. The same for the flow between France and Italy. It seems that in this case France is more reliable than Italy, and we come to this result. And also for the same for this. So as you can see, for France the result is a bit of a mixture of reported export and reported import. It's not always the case. Also here it's a mixed result, Germany to France, Italy and the United Kingdom. But if we look to Italy, Italy seems to be in this example, and I have to stress out that it is an example, but Italy seems to be a bad reporter. Maybe not so strange if you look at the reputation of Italy, but that's how it is. All the flows from Italy are much higher than from their partners, but still, according to the Gallagher method, the result shows that Italy is a bad reporter, and the final result shows just the flows reported by their importers. And since we have a couple of people from the UK, I also want to show the results for the UK, and the UK seems to be a good reporter in this particular example. What are the final results from our work? We have created 12 matrices for each OECD sector. And that includes, again, the ones never published by the OECD officially, but as I told you, we were allowed to use them for this project. It includes the countries and the regions, 27 OECD countries. It also includes the EU 15, which is of course not a country, but that is a helpful region. and Hong Kong and Russia are also in the database. Don't ask me why, I have no idea, but since they were there, we have used them. That makes it 30 and actually 29 countries which GTAP could use. Again, of course, there is also the information which OECD provided for all the flows from all the partner countries, from all the reporter countries to their partners, and some aggregates. And you can find, to make a little advert, you can find all this information in a CPB memorandum. It's number 212 on our website. And you will also be able to download all the data we have calculated there in a spreadsheet. And to conclude my part, my contribution to this presentation, what we will do next. Since this topic is important for CPB, we are trying to make a commitment to contribute for GTAP 8 database. But we're going to use a new source. Recently we have discovered that United Nations has published what they call United Nations Services Trade Statistics database. It's based on the same, as far as I have seen it so far, it's based on the same sectoral disaggregation. But there are more countries available on the database. For instance, the 8 EU 27 non-OECD members, and then you have to think of the Baltic states, Malta, and some other countries. I've also discovered countries like Croatia, Tunisia, and the Ukraine. But more importantly, and that may be clear to you, we hope that there are less missing data. So that is my contribution. I give the mouse to Rob now. Unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, the slides are still with the CPB logo, but Rob, the microphone is to you.
Okay, hello. This is Robert McDougall from the Centre for Global Trade Analysis, and Nico's just been describing the bilateral trade data set which the CPB has provided to us, and which is the first time since about GTAP 2 that we have had a bilateral trade data set feeding into our data construction program. So obviously we're very glad to have that. And as Nico alluded to, what has been in place between releases 3 and 6 was some pseudo bilateral trade data which we constructed ourselves from services imports and exports data. Most recently our data source for that has been the IMF balance of payments statistics. Now what I have to tell you is that the IMF balance of payments statistics data set is still very much a factor in our services trade data construction, and is still exercising a large influence on what you see in the final data set. So let me run through some of its characteristics and then describe why we're continuing to use it. Okay, its first characteristic is that it has a very good country coverage. It has 166 countries, which is not all the countries that there are in the world, but which certainly covers by far the greater part of all the economic activity and trade in the world. So the second characteristic is that it has all and more than all the commodity detail that we require for GTAP purposes. The data set we have from the CPB has most of the detail we require, but not quite all of it. There were, I think, in effect 10 or 11 sectors that we use from it, and from the IMF data set we take 21 sectors, and these then are required at intermediate processing stage. They get reduced again to a somewhat smaller number in the final GTAP database, but we need the IMF data, for instance, to be able to make distinctions between land, sea and air transport, and to make distinctions between freight transport services, which are international margins, and between non-margin transport services, which might be passenger transport or ancillary services. It's incomplete in the sense that the countries typically don't report to the full level of detail that the IMF framework provides, and they don't necessarily report in a very timely way, so it's not always up to date. And sometimes countries will report zeros for flows that very clearly can't be zeros. So there are some data quality issues in the data that the reporting countries report to the IMF. On the other hand, the IMF ensures that it's very well balanced within countries. It's unbalanced globally. What I mean by that is if you take a particular category, let's say sea freight transport services, and look at the total of reported exports, you'll find that that can be very different from the total of reported imports. In fact, it's sometimes the one can be more than twice the other. Now, we wouldn't have the right to expect that the import and export reports would match perfectly, because for a start it's not a globally complete database, but given that it does, we believe, cover the by far the majority of international trade, imbalances as great as that we feel must be largely the result of data inconsistencies. And so it's, in that sense, it's internally inconsistent globally, and naturally, of course, it's also inconsistent with the OECD data that the CPB has been processing. And this is showing you that for some particular instances you get very nice matches. We're seeing nice matches for France and Germany, for instance, and then sometimes we see very large mismatches for transport, for instance, for the Denmark, or for other financial services in the United Kingdom. Okay. So we, in fact, use this, and still, as in the past, we construct our own bilateral trade estimates from this data set. Why do we do that? One of the reasons is, as I just said, that this is the only trade data set we use which has all the commodity detail that we require. And another reason is that the more complete country coverage, as Nico mentioned before, the 29 countries that are reporters in the OECD data set, those 29 countries account for something like 70% of world services trade. But what we take from the CPB is not all of those countries' trade, just trade within the 29 country block, reporter to reporter. And that accounts for something like half of world trade. Well, it's very nice to have some statistical support for the bilateral trade pattern for half of world trade, but we still have to do something about the other half. We are continuing to pick up this IMF data set and clean up the various data deficiencies internally, so far as we're able to, trying to fill in missing values, for instance, using perhaps trade patterns from previous years and the like. And then from that we construct our own bilateral trade estimate in a fairly simplistic way, basically just by prorating exports against imports. So then we balance the CPB estimates against these IMF-based estimates and then overwrite the IMF-based estimates with the CPB-based estimates where available. So let me spell out a little bit more what this means. So we're constructing the bilateral estimates from the IMF data.
Next slide.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, in fact, we in cleaning the data set, we have dealt with the global imbalances. So where there's a global imports of a commodity are very different from differ from global exports of a commodity, we choose some intermediate target and rescale both to meet that target. Then with these data, which are already heavily rescaled in some categories, we construct a full bilateral services trade matrix simply by prorating. We then zero out the diagonal and rebalance again against the original target totals. So by zeroing out the diagonal, we're saying that we don't allow that a country exports to itself. So that gives us a 169 by 169 array or matrix for each services trade commodity. And then we calculate the export and import subtotals just for the 29 CPB reporting countries. So then we take the CPB 29 by 29 block and rebalance those against these subtotals. So the effect of that is that then when we bring these rebalanced CPB estimates in and overwrite the relevant part of the IMF-based estimates, we're still retaining the original IMF-based export and import target totals. And since the CPB has a rather fewer commodities, we just use the, in some cases we use the same CPB array for a few different IMF commodities. So we use the CPB transport matrix, for instance, for all our 9 transport categories: sea freight transport, land passenger transport, and so forth. Okay, but what we see is that the CPB data are indeed adding a lot of value to our initial estimates. We see that in many cases they give drastically different results than what we got by the naive prorating method. So in this slide before you, for instance, just looking at the top line, is saying that exports of other business services from the USA to Germany, two big economies, with the naive prorating approach, we estimate the value of that flow at something like $7.5 billion. But according to bring the CPP data to bear, it comes down to a little under $300 million. So this is one cell that's been revised very greatly downwards. And likewise in the second row, travellers' expenditures, these might include tourism related expenditures from Mexico to the US. You see that this flow has been very greatly upgraded using the CPP data. And in general, we see quite a plausible pattern here. What we're getting from the CPP is that EU countries tend to trade a lot with themselves. In the bottom line, for instance, you see a flow between Austria and Germany, which gets increased greatly. Because the EU trades so much with itself, US-EU trade is less than you'd expect with simple prorating. Trade between the US and its near neighbours, such as Mexico or Canada, is more than proportional. And trade between the United States and Japan also is more than proportional. So we get altogether I think a fairly plausible and quite strong revision of flows within the 29 country bloc. This next slide gives some illustration of the kind of discrepancies we're seeing between the CPP and the IMF data, and bear in mind here that we are, where these discrepancies arise, we are adjusting the CPP data to force it to agree with the IMF data. So looking within the 29 country bloc, we see, for instance, that the IMF thinks that government services account for a higher share of trade within that bloc than the CPP does. The CPP thinks that computer services account for a higher share than the IMF does. And in all these cases, we impose the IMF view. So whereas on the one hand, I've just shown you that the CPP data do very much inform the final GTAP estimates. They have a strong influence on them. Yet it's also the case that the final GTAP estimates still differ quite a lot from the CPP data, and you cannot just read off the CPP numbers in the final GTAP database. And given the various other goals we have to meet, that's really not a reasonable expectation. The next slide is somewhat more in the same vein. This is taking travellers' expenditures within the 29 country bloc and showing that the country composition of these differs somewhat between the CPP and the IMF. Not always so very drastically. I've taken some of the largest discrepancies, and you'll see that by and large they're not, in general, they're not so very large. Mexico, we see that, well, Mexican exports are quite a lot lower in the IMF than in the CPP, almost 60% lower. Hong Kong exports are something like 80% higher. But you look at the USA, you look at Germany, and even if the numbers aren't exactly the same, there's a good deal of qualitative similarity there. Okay, And there's still an abundance of work which, well, quite a few things that could be done to improve on this aspect of the data construction. We feel it should be possible to identify a lot of the false zeros in the IMF data set and take appropriate action, and to take account that these aren't indeed zeros, but they're more like missing reports. Modal shares, I haven't discussed it here, but there's after we've got our bilateral trade arrays for the freight transport services in the three modes, land, sea and air, we then have to apply these to get a much larger array of international trade margins on flows of all the freight commodities between all countries. So we have to say, for instance, things like when coal moves from Australia to Japan, it mostly goes by ship, and there's a large water or sea freight transport margin there, and not a large air freight transport margin. On the other hand, if you're looking at, let's say, exports of diamonds from Botswana to the Netherlands, you get quite different modal shares. And the data that we have to support these splits at present is, how would you say, there's a little bit of data and a lot of extrapolation and guesswork in that. Another area where there's a lot of guesswork is in travellers' expenditures, where again, once we've got our bilateral travellers' expenditures arrays, before we can bring that into the GTAP database, we have to decide which GTAP commodities the travellers are purchasing. And these may be both service and merchandise commodities. And that is done in a way which yes, relies much more on imagination than reported statistics. So there are still some major areas where statistics still need to be brought to bear on this data construction. And that, I think, is about as much as we're going to say in the first run through.
Mm-hmm.
And turn it over to Badri.
One more question.
So if you have any questions, you can please type in the chat pod there. I can see somebody typing. Sarah Taminan.
You can read it on the screen.
To the values.
You can answer it.
Well, I guess the answer is that the values do include intra-company trade, but they don't distinguish intra-company trade. Intra-company trade is a subset of cross-border trade, and that is covered in both the OECD and the IMF data sets.
Yeah, you have to bear in mind, I think, that the IMF and both the OECD get their information from, in most cases, the national banks. That's where the balance of payment statistics originally come from. Of course, we have no idea how these national banks report their data. Okay. Thank you, Arjan.
Barriers to services trade. This is an area where, as yet we've done nothing, and we didn't feel it was appropriate in the past to work on it until we had a much better grasp on the bilateral trade data themselves, which we're now starting to have. So it's a reasonable question now, what, if anything, we propose to do about barriers to services trade. Let me make a few observations about that. One is that these barriers are much more diverse and much harder to measure than barriers to merchandise trade. They typically don't take the form of tariffs. The second thing is that various estimates on smaller or larger subsets of services trade are available through heroic work by various econometricians and statisticians. And the third observation is that once you've got these things, you then still have quite a lot of thinking to do about how to incorporate them into a data set and into a general equilibrium model. And in many cases you might prefer not to treat them as ad valorem tariff equivalents, since they're liable to act quite differently. Unlike tariffs in particular, they don't typically create revenue in the hands of the importing country government. So I would say that the way is open now for a pilot exercise to incorporate these in some extended version of GTAP, and this would involve in effect some more or less experimental features and novelties on the theory side to incorporate these trade barriers. This is not on the agenda for us for GTAP 8. We have a stack of other things which seem even more urgent than that, but of course it doesn't mean that other esteemed stakeholders can't or shouldn't attempt the exercise.
Okay, Rob, there are some more questions. One of these from Arjan Lejour. One of the problems in combining the OECD data delivered by CPB and the IMF data are the difference in totals, as Rob showed. Has anybody an idea which of the data sources is better? Oh, my screen is going. Are there good reasons to use the IMF totals as benchmark?
This is an open question for...
It's a kind of an open question
for all the
everybody,
participants
so
here.
we don't really have to answer it, but...
Next question.
Well, at least I can say that, as Rob already mentioned, CPB has only provided data for 29 countries. IMF has got data for, as far as I remember, 166 countries. That maybe not really justify why IMF data are better than OECD, but it's at least more than the 29.
Our decision to use the IMF totals as benchmark, and truly they're not the IMF totals, but our own IMF-based but substantially revised totals. It was not based on judgment that the IMF data were more accurate, but well, largely for convenience. In other words, I could see how to impose IMF totals on the CPB data, more or less reasonably.
Mhm.
I couldn't see how to do the contrary, though I'm sure it could be done with sufficient effort.
Oh.
It is because the CPB, so because the IMF covers more countries, because it has the more complete commodity detail is why we prefer it. Not that we have any reason to believe their numbers more accurate than the OECD's. But it's clear that to set up the goal of preserving the OECD or the IMF data is quite infeasible, because for both those data sets the internal inconsistencies are pervasive and in many instances major. So you can't preserve an inconsistent data set.
No.
We're bending the CPB data a lot to make it agree with the IMF data, but the CPB data themselves are already gone through some major internal reconciliation, and the same goes for the IMF.
Exactly. Then there is a question from Mike Bouwmeester, which he addresses to CPB. Is Ian still online? What I've seen of services, trade data makes me very suspicious of any value reported. In case of one value, this value is adopted. Does CPB undertake any sort of outlier analysis? Oh, that is the answer of Ian. The answer is no. Data availability was a limitation for this. For GTAP 8, with the 2007 data, the opportunities are better to track trade developments over time and sorting out outliers. That is correct. I agree with that.
And there's a question from Sarah coming in.
Yeah.
How easy do you think it will be to macro project these values to 2009?
I don't know. I'm not going to do that. We're going to construct a GTAP 8 data set for 2007, and it's going to be based on new statistics. IMF and UN we envisage for 2007, supplemented where necessary perhaps by observations from earlier years.
No.
Maria has a question. You can go ahead.
There are still people typing. Do you have any intention of using sub-levels in the hierarchy of...
Yeah, can see it there.
You will have to...
Go down there.
That has to go down.
Nico, did you have control of that, the master?
No. Oh yes, you have. No.
No?
This one.
Oh.
Yeah.
Questioning we.
Thinking in a two-country model. You can see the question there.
Thinking in a two-country model, particular country role model, which countries do have better bilateral services data? I don't understand the question.
Well, you've assigned some reliability indices between countries.
Oh, I see. You can look at the indices in our paper. So from there on, you can have an idea which countries are more reliable than other countries. I hope that will answer your question, Maria.
Okay. Okay, I have a question from Marta Badra, which I think I can answer at least in part. Do you have any intention of using sub-levels in the hierarchy of the EBOPs to check data. Well, that more or less is something that we did, or we do in handling the IMF data.
Yeah.
We have to deal with this hierarchical structure because some countries report only the higher level classes and some countries report lower level classes. And so we have quite some work to do to account for the varied reporting practices. And so we collect data at all the various applicable levels of the hierarchy as low as we need to go. And then we check it for consistency. And in fact, what we've found with the IMF data is very good nominal consistency. You look at what a country, for those countries that do report, let's say, land, sea and air transport data, you'll find reliably that it adds up consistently to total transport. We think there are some hidden issues there. For instance, a country might report zero flows of air and land transport and report sea transport only. And what we think is going on there is it just has its total transport figure. So it's only at that higher level of the hierarchy that it's reporting truthfully. And at the lower level, it's giving us these false zeros in various categories. But just from a formal aspect, without considering the plausibility of the data, in the IMF, the cross-level consistency is very good.
I may add to that the answer from Iron, I think, also contributes to that question. As I showed, if you look at more disaggregated levels, sub-levels, for instance, within other commercial services, the quality is lower. That's one of the reasons why the title of our paper is The Quality of Bilateral Services Trade Data, and the subtitle is Contribution to GTAP 7 Database. So what we have tried to do is to improve the quality of it, but as I said in my introduction, there is still a lot to be done, especially on those sub-levels.
So Bill Powers has a question. You can go ahead.
What do we have to do to see it?
I don't see that question, Angel, from Badra. From who? Bill Powers?
No, he raised his hand. He's just typing.
Oh, okay.
There was one question about the project there.
Here's one for you.
So this GTAP 8 database, we are aiming for sometime next year or earlier 2012. So we don't have a full schedule for GTAP 8 database yet, and we'll announce it once we are ready with the schedule. But we are going to start the cycle very soon. There's a question from Bill Powers.
Okay. Bill Powers asks, any thought of using variables such as merchandise trade to predict missing flows? We have thought about that, and in fact, although I didn't talk about it, it's even listed on the last slide. So one of the possible improvements that we might make in processing the IMF data is, rather than taking this zeroed out diagonal prorated matrix as our starting estimate, to take the merchandise trade pattern as a starting estimate, and indications are that this would be a good deal better. But a lot of the same patterns that you see in the services trade, one also sees in the merchandise trade. For instance, high trade within the European Union, high trade between US, Canada and Mexico, and so forth. Now, of course, in those particular cases, those flows that I just mentioned are flows where we're going to, in the end, prefer the CPB estimate anyway. But presumably, for the 50% of world trade that the CPB doesn't get cover, and perhaps with the UN it'll be a little less than 50%, but still presumably a substantial fraction, that merchandise trade pattern might give us significantly better results. The main reason we haven't done it now is, essentially programming considerations. It's convenient for us to be able to construct this services trade data set in a standalone way and not to have it depending on the merchandise trade data set, which is being compiled independently at the same time. But so it's the prorating is convenient and easy, but since data quality is more important than our convenience, it is a contemplated work item to use the merchandise trade pattern.
So there's a question on documentation. We have mentioned in the GTAP 7 documentation page that most of the chapters are ready, but for certain chapters for which we still don't have the update for version 7, for the time being the users can refer to GTAP 6 documentation, and we expect to complete all the chapters in the near future. We are just expecting contribution from the contributors. For protection, most of it is done. Just the chapter on tariff data is pending, and we have heard from the contributor that we will be getting the chapter by a month or so. So for the trade data, I can say the same thing. Like, we are expecting it in near future. For services trade, there is some information available from this live session, and we also had a special data session in the conference on global economic analysis in Santiago.
Here we go. Now we're back.
Sorry about the interruption. There was some the internet was down and the audio was down for a while. So I was talking about the documentation. So what I was trying to say was that the chapters for version 7 documentation on trade and protection should be up very soon, like in a month or so, and we for the chapters for which have not yet been uploaded, we have information in other sources. For example, for the services trade data, we have this presentation and this data session, and we also had a session on GTAP 7 database in Santiago in the conference on global economic analysis in 2009, June 2009. So we request you to have a look at these presentations, and in a month or so we'll be coming up with the chapters. And for other chapters, you can also have a look at the GTAP 6 database documentation. So the procedures remain same for most of them, and just the numbers are different, and that will be updated in a month or so. So that's what we can say at this moment about the documentation. Hope all of you can hear us.
Seems so. There is an interesting discussion going on between Arjan Lejour and Bill Powers. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Rob.
Well, I mean, I don't see production data as particularly pertinent if we already have the export and import data. I don't see what production would add beyond that.
Yeah, I agree with it. Is there any more question? Oh, but we should.
Any more questions? So if we have no more questions, so there are some questions, at least one. Maria.
That means that there is a question.
So here's a question from Maria.
Do I think we'll be able to include the information from the IMF in GTAP 8? Yes, I do. The IMF data set seems to be a stable data set being actively maintained, so I expect that we'll be able to bring it into GTAP 8 in very much the same way as we have in GTAP 7.
Just that to add to it, it's just that we hope that we can add more bilateral information from the UN source in the future, so that less information from IMF is necessary. The more we can do on a bilateral level, the less is needed from IMF, but IMF will, I think, for a long time be necessary, because there are a good number of countries which will not be covered in the bilateral database from any source.
Yeah.
Khalid is typing a question. Yeah, I had answered this question before. GTAP 8 schedule is yet to be prepared, but right now what we can say is you can expect it sometime the end of 2011 or early 2012. But this is just tentative, and we'll inform all the users when we have a proper schedule. And as you all know, we have a long cycle for each database construction. So we first start with approaching all the contributors, and we get the contributions, and then we prepare some pre-releases which go to the GTAP board members and the data contributors, and once we hear from the board members and data contributors every time we go for a pre-release about any problems in the database or any improvements that are possible, and we keep improving and we keep fixing the errors, and finally we come up with the final release. And and typically a database cycle is 2 to 3 years. So we have just started GTAP 8 database cycle internally. So we expect something by 2012. But that's all I can tell about the release date of GTAP 8 right now, and you'll get more information maybe after a few months or so. So any more questions from the participants? Okay, so if there are no more questions, we can go ahead and end the session. And thank you very much for all the participants for asking serious questions, and we also would like to thank Aryan for answering many of the questions, being in Netherlands, and of course Nico. I thank Nico van Leeuwen and Robert McDougall for answering all the questions, and for your patience, the patience of all the participants in being present for the entire presentation and for asking questions. Have a good day, and thank you very much.
Thank
See you
you.
in the next database session.